Morning, church. Say, I have a question for the young, the kids, and the young at heart. I guess we'll include you too, and the old at heart that still remember when you were young at heart. How many of you have ever played hide and seek? Anybody? Most of you have played hide and seek. What's more fun, hiding or seeking? Which do you like best? Hiding. Mostly hiding. You love, there's one who loves seeking. Are you good at it? Yeah, you can find those people who are hiding really good. That's good. You know, have you ever played hide and seek, either as a hider or a seeker, with a small child? The games are short, but they're fun. I can remember things like having the child hide. Probably did this with my kids at some point when they were younger as well. And they would, Judy would tell them where to hide in the room, and I'd go in the other room, and then they'd be hiding. And before I even came into the room, they're just almost vibrating with excitement. Are they under the couch pillow? No, they're not under the couch pillow, and you can hear them giggling already because they got a good hiding spot. And the whole point of the game isn't to stay hidden for a long time. The point of the game is to get found, because that's when the hugging and the tickling and the laughing and all that kind of thing happens. The point of the game is the reconnection point, the time when you're found, the time when you're together again. At least that's the way the game goes when it's fun. But sometimes as we get older, we start to have experiences where not everything that happens between us and other people is fun. Sometimes it's painful, uncomfortable. Sometimes it's things that can make us angry or hurt us. And so we learn how to hide. Sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. We hide how we think. We hide how we feel because we don't want to be vulnerable. And the more often we're hurt, the more we feel that vulnerability, and the better we get at learning how to be more or less invisible to the people around us. Oh, we're there, we're physically there, we're going through the motions of things, but we don't really want to get noticed by some people, and maybe in the worst cases by anyone, because we're afraid we're going to get hurt even more. What if you hid? What if you were playing hide and seek and you hid, and you were hiding for a long time and nobody came to find you? What if you jumped out and waved your hands and yelled, I'm here, and there was no one there to look for you? Would it be fun just because you won? It wouldn't be fun if there's not the connection. When hide and seek is a competition, when hide and seek is protecting ourselves, it isn't much fun. It's only fun when there's that connection of love, where we are seen, where we are known, where we're found. That human tendency to learn how to hide is something that touches most of our lives, if not all. Have you ever felt alone, abused, treated unfairly, misunderstood, inadequate, unworthy, invisible? We're going to look at someone today in our sermon series. I can't remember the name of that series now. It's there. Ordinary People, Extraordinary God. As we continue in that series, we're going to look at an ordinary person, Hagar. And Hagar she's not an outstanding, huge character in the scripture. She's really a minor character in the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac. She shows up there, but in a sense, she's not a character who shows up as some in the Old Testament, like Ruth and Rahab, who are put in there because they're part of the line of Christ. She didn't win great victories for God's people like Deborah. She was an ordinary, perhaps a less than ordinary person in the eyes of many people. She's that minor character in Abraham and Sarah's story. But I'm going to try to tell her story, at least a part of it, from her perspective. It looks different when you look at it from Hagar's perspective than when you read the scripture thinking of what God was doing in the life, in the promises, in the covenant with Abraham and with Sarah. When you look at it from Hagar's perspective, it's quite different. We know that Hagar is a slave. We know that from Scripture. We know that from Genesis chapter 16, from the Scripture that was read, that she is Sarai's slave. We know she's from Egypt. So we're going to jump back a couple of chapters to Genesis chapter 12, where many of you know the story of Abraham taking Sarah and his whole clan going down to Egypt because there was a famine in the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised him, but the land that wasn't really sustaining him right at that particular time. We know that Sarah was a slave. We know she was Egyptian. So let's imagine, and I don't think it's too far out to think that Sarah actually was acquired by Abraham during the time that she was in Egypt. Imagine then that Sarah was a slave in Pharaoh's household. Perhaps in the area of women, serving Pharaoh's wives in some way, doing whatever slaves do, whatever they're asked to do, whatever they're required to do. She had slave expectations, which means not much. Did she have a future? Well, someone else would decide what her future was. I guess the best thing that a slave could hope for would be a master that was reasonably well off, so she wouldn't suffer from hunger. She wouldn't suffer from a lack of clothing and shelter, that she would, if she's in the household of someone who's fairly wealthy, perhaps she was in Pharaoh's household, it could be a relatively good life, as life for a slave goes. She probably had slave posture. Is it different? Yeah. Slave posture is head down, eyes turned to the side, don't have an opinion, don't volunteer anything, do what you're told, nothing else, be there, but mostly, if possible, be invisible, because the masters can do whatever they want, and if they happen to be in a bad mood, you really, as a slave, want to be invisible. So Hagar, a slave in Pharaoh's household, and she hears the rumors of what's happening out in the community. There's this clan come down from Canaan. It's not a ragtag bunch of refugees. This group of people is rich. They've got flocks and herds that cover the skyline. They're on the move all the time. This is a nomadic group. They're on the move all the time because if they stayed in one place too long, the ground would be bare. Everything would have been grazed down to nothing. And they're rich. They've got goods from Canaan. They've got silver. They've got gold. They've got servants. And while they're there, while they come down to Egypt for a break from Canaan, perhaps to give the land in Canaan a break from all their overgrazing, they get some attention from the Egyptians. They get some attention not just because of the wealth of this man, Abraham, who's leading this clan, this group of people. There's some attention because of his sister. The rumors are that she is the most beautiful woman that has been seen in Egypt in the memory of the people who are there. The whispers are going around about who she is. The women in Pharaoh's household are scoffing at this. How can some woman who travels around the countryside and following the sheep and the goats, how can she be more beautiful than those of us in Pharaoh's household who have the best lotions and the best cosmetics. We never feel sand blown in our faces by the wind. We never get calluses on our hands because of anything, even remotely resembling work. How can this woman be beautiful? But the rumors persist, and Pharaoh's officials go out and they check it out, and they come back, and it sounds like Pharaoh's impressed. At least his officials are impressed, so he's going to take her as another wife. Yeah, the women in Pharaoh's household as wives, they were skeptical, but they're also a little worried. If she is that beautiful, is there a chance that she might usurp some of them? There's a pretty strong social order in this group of women. They know who's on top, and they know who has to defer to who. If this woman comes in and she's that beautiful, is there a chance she might usurp some of their position? So they get kind of worried. They're used to women coming in. I mean, Pharaoh and others like him, kings and princes and wealthy men, they tend to marry for political alliance, and it's pretty common. A lot of the women that would be in Pharaoh's household would be there for that reason. And this would be a good alliance for Pharaoh as well, because if this rich man, Abraham, if they can make a connection with him, and Pharaoh can marry his sister, then there's a bond there. He's not going to cause trouble for Pharaoh. He has connections in Canaan, which is also good for the kingdom, for Pharaoh to know. And so it's a good connection. And it'll be good for Abraham as well, because if he has Pharaoh's favor, he'll get rich as well. And so then she's there. Then it happens. She's in Pharaoh's household. She's in the area for new wives, whatever that area is. She's being taught, this is the way you behave in Pharaoh's household. This is where things are. And of course, if she's one of Pharaoh's wives, she gets a slave. Maybe it happened to be Hagar, who became Sarah's slave. We know she was Sarah's slave later. We know she's from Egypt. We know Sarah was at some point in Pharaoh's household. It's possible, but that's when Hagar became Sarah's slave. So there is Hagar with this new assignment. Serve this woman who stands out in the crowd. Something about her. You forget other people in the crowd, but you don't forget her. And then, things happen really well. Just to read a couple of verses from chapter 12. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abraham well for her sake, and Abraham acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. You can kind of substitute the word slave for servants there if you like, because they're pretty interchangeable in the story. Sarah was a slave, or Hagar was a slave, kind of listed somewhere between male and female donkeys and camels. That's kind of the value. That's how slaves could see themselves, were listed in the list of livestock. And those are things that Abram was acquiring when he was there. But so he was getting rich. Sarah was in Pharaoh's household. And then things started to go wrong. People started to get sick. The women in Pharaoh's household started to get sick. And the managers, they didn't know what to do. The physicians they had didn't know what to do. The magicians they had didn't know what to do. And then it came out. God had spoken to Pharaoh and let Pharaoh know what was going on. And this Pharaoh, much different than the Pharaoh several generations later that dealt with Moses, this Pharaoh listened when God spoke. And God told him, "You're in trouble, man. You married Abraham's wife. You took his wife. She's not just his sister, she's his wife." And Pharaoh was worried. Because God said, you need to give her back. You need to stop this. I recognize you did it in ignorance. That's why you're still alive. And so he gave Sarah back and sent Abraham away. His stay in Egypt was short, but he acquired a lot of things while he was there. He got richer while he was there. And one of the things he probably acquired at that time was Hagar. So back to Canaan. Now Hagar is Sarah's slave. She's a slave. She doesn't get a choice. Would anyone ask her, would you like to go with this new group to Canaan? No, that's not a choice. Would you like to leave your family? Would you like to leave your country? Would you like to leave the only home you've known? That's not a choice she had. She was a slave. Somebody else made those choices for her. So she went along, and she did what she was asked to do. Time passed, up to 10 years. We're not sure exactly when in his 10-year stay in Canaan that Abraham went down and came back from Egypt, but there was quite a few years up until the time of Genesis chapter 16, that next part of the story that Michael read. And as that time passed, I can imagine Hagar in Abram's household learning about the God of Abraham, learning about the promises. I don't know how much Abram told everyone in his household, in his family and clan, about the promises God made, but Hagar was Sarah's slave. That was close. I'm sure she heard a lot of things. She could see Abram's devotion to God. And so not only did she see and learn about Abram's God, she also learned some things and saw some things about the relationship between Abram and Sarah. Sarah was obviously the love of his life. He was a rich and powerful man, not quite like Pharaoh, but not an ordinary man. And it was weird. He only had one wife. He was 75 and she was 65 when it came into the land now. At 10 years later, he was 85. She was 75, and she was still his only wife. Rich men, powerful men, rulers and princes did not have only one wife. They always had more than one wife because they wanted to be assured of multiple heirs to take over their estate. And Abram's estate, if he died now, was going to go to the chief servant in his house. Wasn't going to go. He didn't have an heir to pass things on to. Didn't make a lot of sense, I imagine, to Hagar at that point. She saw Abraham's God. She learned of Abraham's love for his wife Sarah, but she also learned another thing. She learned about Sarah's pain. 75 years. How long had they known each other? Probably all of Sarah's life. They did, after all, we read later on in Scripture that they were brother and sister. They had the same father, but not the same mother. So they grew up in the same household. And then they married as well. So they'd known each other all their lives. 75 years she'd known Abram. Only man that she'd ever been with, and he with her. There was a deep relationship. And Sarah, we already heard about her great beauty that caught the attention of people around her. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to see the people staring at her when she went to a new place and admiring her. The admiration of the people around her, the love of Abram, none of those things was enough to cover up the pain that she didn't have a child. And in that time and in that culture, that was one of the main things that gave someone status and importance and value. And she had no children. You've heard the saying at some point probably that A definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Well, Sarah was no fool. She concluded that God had kept her from having children. At 75, she had no reason to believe that was going to change. And so she decided to do something differently. She decided to use her slave, Hagar, as a surrogate mother. Well, I'm not talking about the kind of medical technology we have now where it's actually, where it would actually be Sarah's physical child, but think of it in a slave owner mentality. This is my slave. I own her womb. If she has a baby, the baby is mine. I can build a family through her because a slave belongs to me. And there's this confusing bit where she gives her slave to Abram to be his wife, and she has this dual role. What is she? Is she a slave? Is she a wife? Well, she's a second wife, and in that culture, there's some limitation to that. She's still a slave. Did she ask Hagar whether that was a good idea? Probably not. It's unlikely she had an opinion in that because she was a slave. She had to do what she was told, whether she wanted to or not. Was she physically forced? Probably not. But she'd been a slave all her life. And the weight of, I'm a slave, I have to do what I'm told, was too much for a young woman to throw off at that instant. And so she did what she was told as a slave. She went to Abram as his second wife. And she got pregnant. And when she was pregnant, something changed. She began to see herself as a person. There's something different between a slave and a person. A slave is property. You can trade camels, you can trade donkeys, you can trade goats and sheep and cattle and slaves. But now she began to see herself as a person. She had a role, she had an importance. It wasn't just do what you're told because you're a slave. She began to see herself as something more. And one day, she was there and Sarah told her to do something, and she looked up and she looked Sarah in the eye. And it wasn't submission. It was defiance. It was something else in Hagar's eyes that Sarah had never seen before. And Sarah started to look around and pay attention. What's going on here? You're my slave. And she noticed that Abram, now, when he looked at Hagar, and Hagar actually looked up and looked back, and she could see in Abram's eyes, in Abram's face, some approval. Here is one. She's not the person I've known for all her life. She's not the love of my life. But here's someone I approve of. She's carrying my child. And it was too much for Sarah to take. And so she stormed off into Abram's tent and she let him have it. She poured out her complaint. I put my slave in your hands, and now she thinks she's better than I am. I am not having this. This is not happening. And it's your fault, too. You're not treating her like a slave anymore, Abram. May God judge between you and me how you have wronged me in the way you have turned my slave against me. And Abram, what does he do? When his wife is that upset, this whole thing was Sarah's idea in the first place. But, okay, I can't resist the temptation to put in a little plug about husband-wife relationships here. And how many of you guys have ever heard, this is your fault? And what's the answer? No, you don't defend yourself. There's no way to argue that. What are you going to do? It's your, okay, she's pregnant. It's my fault. This was all your idea to start with? No, that's not going to fly. So he says, basically the only thing he can think of to say, she's your slave. You do with her whatever you think is the right thing to do. So he's going back to, okay, I'm going back to slave mentality. I won't think of her as a person. I'll think of her as your slave. That's what you want. That's fine. You can do that. And so Sarah abuses her. I don't know what form that abuse took. I don't know whether it was words. For sure there was words. Whether there was anything physical, whether there was some kinds of restrictions on her activity and her life, whether she got grounded, whether she got her movements restricted, whether she got poorer food. I don't know what it was. But the text indicates that this is something that Sarah hadn't done before. She hadn't been a cruel master to Hagar before, but now she was. And there was a purpose to it, and she was successful. Hagar did something that she wouldn't have done before. If this had happened earlier in her life, when the only thing Hagar could think is, I'm a slave, she probably would have bowed her head and said, yes, I'm sorry, mistress. Whatever you say, mistress, it's all my fault. She probably would have thought, I'm a slave. I don't have any right to protest. And she didn't really protest. That wouldn't have been very effective. But she did something she could never have done before. She ran away. She actually took some initiative. She had to begin to think of herself as a person before she could even take that kind of initiative. And so she ran away. Running away is a form of hiding. It's a way of getting away. And there she was at the spring. And what was she going to do now? She'd never been on her own before. She'd never been outside some kind of a big household with lots of people in their different roles. She didn't have anybody to serve. Where's she going to go? What's she going to do? And they're not going to come looking for her. Sarah is not going to come looking for her. Sarah's good riddance. She's gone. That's my problem solved. Abraham is not going to send anyone to look for her either, because that's not going to work. And neither is anyone else in Abram's household going to come looking for Hagar. She's alone, and nobody's looking for her except God. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar by this spring. And the angel of the Lord is a reference. Angel is messenger, but the angel of the Lord is a reference to God himself appearing to someone. And it's the first time in the scripture that phrase is used as the angel of the Lord meets with Hagar. And later on she says, you are the God who sees me. So she knows who it is who found her, who's seeking her, who came looking for her and found her there at the spring. And the angel of the Lord asks her, so, Hagar, slave of Sarah, where'd you come from? Where are you going? I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarah. And like people who run away, they can only answer half that question. I know where I'm going. I know where I come from, but I have no idea where I'm going. She didn't answer that last part of the question because she didn't know. She didn't have a place to go. There really wasn't anywhere for her. And so the angel said to her, go back. Go back. But I love these short passages where in a couple of sentences it describes what's probably a much bigger conversation. Go back. Go back to Sarah and submit to her. It is the only place, but it's also the place your son needs to be. See, you're pregnant. You're going to have a son. You're going to name him Ishmael, And he is going to be a future that you don't have yourself. And that's not going to happen if you keep heading out into the desert. That's going to happen if you go back and submit to Sarah. And then your son, at least for the next 14 years, is going to be living there and under the influence of a godly father. He's going to know his father. He's not going to be one who grows up as an orphan. He's going to have at least those first years of his childhood under Abraham's influence. And we know that Abram loved his son, Ishmael. And so he sends her back. But he sends her back different. Not just as property anymore. There's a sense now, and we read at the end of that chapter, I have seen the one who sees me. You are the God who sees me, is what she said to God, to the angel of the Lord. She knew now that she wasn't a nobody. She was somebody. She was somebody in God's eyes. Somebody God would seek out. Somebody God would give a plan to. And not only was she seen, but she also had hope. There was a future because Ishmael was going to grow up. And so the angel said some things about what Ishmael was going to be like. And in the past, I've read that passage, and it's confused me because it looks like Hagar, you're going to have a son, and he's going to be a wild, unruly person who nobody can get along with. It doesn't sound exactly like a blessing, but I want to thank Kelvin Friebel for some insights that he shared with me regarding the Hebrew in that passage and the context of that passage. So let me read again for you what the angel said as a blessing. I will increase your descendants so much that they'll be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord said to her, you're now pregnant. You'll give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. Doesn't sound like what a mother would want to hear here and now. But if you understand where that is, the wild donkey is the symbol of freedom. It's not a domesticated donkey who's going to get a burden put on his back. The wild donkey is free. And the angel is speaking to a slave. What is she going to value? Freedom. Hagar, I know you've lived all your life as a slave. You're going to have a son, and he is going to be free. He's not going to be a slave. There's some hope in your future. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Again, we kind of think of that in conflict terms, but think of it in status terms instead of conflict terms. He's not under anyone's hand, and he doesn't have people under his hand. It's much more of an equal relationship to those around him. He's going to be free, and he's going to deal with people as he deals with people. He's not going to be subservient to anyone. And he will live in hostility toward all his brothers. That's how most of the translations put it. And if you noted the details, there is an alternate translation, and that's the one Mike read early. He will live to the east of all his brothers. And if you look at the further chapters in Genesis, look particularly at Genesis chapter 21 and Genesis chapter 25, it makes a lot more sense because there's not a hostility between Ishmael and Isaac at any point in their lives. When Abram dies many years later, Ishmael comes home, and Ishmael and Isaac together bury their father Abram. When Isaac's son Esau, Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and when Isaac's son Esau realizes that he's kind of upset his parents by marrying a couple of local girls that the parents do not approve of in any way. I think Rebecca, Esau's mom, said something like, if Jacob marries one of these Hittite women, my life won't be worth living. So let's send Jacob back to my brother to find a wife back among my relatives. And then Esau looks at that and he says, oh, my parents don't like my wives. They don't think much of my wives. I'll fix that. And so he goes and he marries a daughter of his uncle Ishmael. And so there's just not a lot of indication that there's a hostility between Isaac and Ishmael. Rather, we do learn in Genesis chapter 25 that Ishmael, when he does eventually leave and raise his own family, that's where he settles. It is to the east of the land of Canaan. It's also a reminder to Hagar that I have a plan, and Canaan, I have promised that land to Abram, and later on that is shown to be what Isaac inherits. But there's a plan for Ishmael too, and it's further to the east. It's a different land, but he also gets a land. And at the end of that, Hagar is saying, you are the God who sees me. Now I have seen the one who sees me. It's a change in her from the slave, the nobody, the piece of property, to a person who's valued by God and by those around her, from no future to having a future. There's probably more I could go into, but I promised my wife it wouldn't be that long. That's enough of Hagar's story to recognize that the nobodies, the small people, God pays attention to them as well. The people who aren't main storyline. How many of us feel like we're the main storyline of all the things God is doing in the world? And yet, He sees each of us where we are, what we are, with whatever we're going through. And He cares about us. And He sees us, and He wants us not just to know that we're seen. It's one thing, right, to know there is a God who sees me, but it's another step to have a relationship to say, I have seen the God who sees me. He sees me, but I see Him too. I see Him at work. It's a relationship. There's something going on here that's more than what's happening in the world. I have a relationship with God, and He's walking with me. It might be tough stuff like it was for Hagar. Go back and live with Sarah for a while, because that's where your future lies. It may be times of celebration. It may be times of struggle. But God will be with us through all of that too. And can we claim that for ourselves as followers of Jesus? Remember, Jesus is the one who finds lost things. He told the story, Luke chapter 15, of finding the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. God's in the business of finding lost things, misplaced things, things that maybe others haven't valued. He's the one who finds the small things. Remember the man named Zacchaeus who came to look for Jesus. And Jesus said, hey, I see you there in the tree. I'm coming to your house today. And at the end of that visit, he celebrated that Zacchaeus was someone who is now a child of Abraham as well. Can you say, I've seen the one who sees me? We can say intellectually God sees us, but can you say, yeah, and I see Him too. I know Him. He's part of my life. Do you feel, or have you ever felt, lost, neglected, abused, overlooked, forgotten, unworthy? There's a place with Jesus for all those people who've ever felt that. And we're coming to the communion table and we're reminded that the big story is that God has sent his Son to welcome each of us, not just into his broad family, but to his table. I invite you to think of the communion table as Jesus' table for all the small people, all the people who didn't think they were all that important, who struggled to find value, who got overlooked sometimes. But Jesus found them. Jesus knows where you are, and he's inviting you to come and to know him as well. I'm going to ask Mike to come.